bank's voice was calm when it said, "We've reviewed your loan. Come in alone." "Don't tell your husband." I stood there, hand still on the zipper of my suitcase, the metallic sound echoing longer than it should have. Behind me, he hummed, carefree, folding shirts we couldn't afford, planning a vacation we had no right to take. The room smelled faintly of his cologne and freshly printed travel tickets. Everything looked normal. That was the first lie. "Who was that?" he asked without looking up. "Spam," I replied just as quietly. But my pulse had already shifted, slower, colder, precise. Banks don't whisper secrets unless there's something to hide, and they don't separate husbands and wives unless one of them isn't telling the truth. I watched him laugh at something on his phone, a private smile he didn't share. In that moment, I understood. The loan wasn't the problem. It was him. I've always been the one who makes things work quietly. Numbers, schedules, compromises, I held them together like threads no one noticed until they snapped. Before the marriage, before the shared accounts and polite dinners, I built my life on careful decisions. Stability mattered to me. Transparency mattered more. He liked to call me the planner. Half a compliment, half a dismissal. It meant he didn't have to think too hard about consequences. I handled bills before they became problems. Smoothed over awkward conversations. Remembered due dates he forgot existed. It became a rhythm. I managed, he moved. There were signs, of course. Small ones. The way he'd tilt his phone away mid-text. The casual, "I'll handle it" whenever money came up. Yet somehow, I still ended up fixing things. I told myself it was partnership. That trust sometimes looks like silence. But silence has weight. And over time, I realized mine was doing all the heavy lifting. To him, I was predictable. Safe. Someone who would nod, adjust, absorb. He underestimated how closely I paid attention. Because when you spend years being overlooked, you don't become blind, you become precise. The days leading up to the bank visit unfolded like they always did, quietly uneven. He'd leave conversations half-finished, as if my questions were optional. "I'll take care of it," he'd say, already turning away, his tone light but final. It wasn't reassurance. It was dismissal dressed as confidence. At dinner, his phone would buzz against the table, and he'd glance at it, not urgently, just enough to break eye contact. A flicker of a smile, quickly hidden behind a sip of water. When I asked, he'd shrug. Work stuff. Always vague, always just enough. I started noticing pauses. The way he'd hesitate before answering simple questions. Like timelines needed editing. Receipts would go missing. Numbers didn't quite align, but never enough to confront. Just enough to unsettle. One evening, I found him standing by the window, speaking in a low voice. When he noticed me, the call ended mid-sentence. "Wrong number," he said too quickly. The room felt smaller after that. None of it was loud. No arguments, no accusations. Just a steady erosion of clarity. And underneath it all, a quiet certainty began to form. He wasn't just hiding something. He was counting on me not to look too closely. The bank office was colder than I expected. Not physically controlled. Polished. But in the way the air seemed to hold its breath. The advisor didn't waste time with pleasantries. She slid a folder across the desk and watched me instead of the papers, as if measuring how much I already knew. There were 2 loans. One I recognized, the one we had applied for together. The second sat beneath it like a shadow, older, larger, and signed with a version of my name I hadn't written. My signature, carefully replicated. My identity, quietly borrowed. I didn't react. Not there. I read every line, every date, every transfer that led to accounts. I didn't recognize, but somehow belonged to us, no to him. The advisor's voice softened when she said, "We needed to confirm you were aware." I nodded once. That was all. Walking out, the sunlight felt sharper, like it was cutting something open inside me. Every small moment from the past weeks rearranged itself into something clearer, colder, undeniable. He hadn't just lied. He had rewritten reality and expected me to live inside it. And in that moment, something settled quietly into place. I wasn't going to confront him. I was going to correct everything. I didn't rush. Rushing is how you make mistakes. And I had already been living inside one. That night, I behaved exactly the same. I asked about dinner, folded clothes beside him, even reminded him about our vacation. He smiled, relaxed, certain the version of me he knew was still intact, predictable, manageable. While he slept, I opened my laptop. Years ago, before marriage softened my edges, I worked in financial compliance. Not glamorous, but precise. Documentation, verification, fraud patterns. I knew exactly how signatures were traced, how timelines exposed intent, how quietly a case could build before it ever made a sound. I started with copies. Every statement, every loan document, every inconsistency I had once dismissed. I requested full transaction histories under my legal rights, flagged the forged signature, and documented the discrepancies in a timeline that left no room for interpretation. Then I separated what was mine. Accounts first, access points next. I changed passwords, redirected notifications, secured anything tied to my name. Not aggressively, surgically. By morning, nothing looked different. But everything had shifted. He still believed I was standing beside him. He didn't realize I had already stepped out of the version of our life he controlled, and into one where every move from here on would be deliberate, documented, and impossible to undo. I chose a weekday morning, ordinary enough to go unnoticed, precise enough to matter. He left for work with the same distracted kiss, the same half-finished sentence about booking a dinner for our trip. I nodded, already knowing neither would happen. An hour later, I sat across from my lawyer, the folder between us heavier now, not with paper but with clarity. We filed everything in sequence: identity fraud, financial misrepresentation, unauthorized debt. No drama, no threats, just facts, aligned and submitted. By noon, the bank had frozen the disputed loan. By afternoon, his access to the joint accounts was restricted, pending investigation. Procedures, they called it, standard. I didn't call him. Instead, I packed one suitcase, the same one from that day, and left it by the door. Not to run, but to mark the end of something that had already collapsed. When his messages started, they came in fragments. Confusion first, then urgency, then a careful shift toward explanations that no longer mattered. I read them all once. Then I turned my phone face down. Outside, the light hadn't changed. Cars moved, people passed, the world remained indifferent. But inside, something had settled cleanly into place. Not revenge, correction. The calls came in layers. First, his rapid, uneven, shifting from confusion to controlled concern. Then his family, softer in tone but sharper in implication. There must be a misunderstanding, his mother said, as if clarity itself were negotiable. I didn't argue. I let silence do what explanations never could. By the second day, the tone changed. The bank stopped calling me for confirmation and started addressing him directly. Procedures moved forward, not because I pushed, but because the evidence did. His messages grew careful, then defensive, then quiet. Mutual friends reached out in cautious fragments. We heard something. Never finishing the sentence. Reputation doesn't collapse loudly. It erodes in private conversations, in pauses where certainty used to be. I returned to work without announcement. Routine became my anchor again. People noticed the absence before they asked about it. And when they did, I kept it simple. We're separating. No details, no spectacle. Because this was never about winning. It was about truth holding its shape, even when someone tried to bend it. And maybe that's why it matters, because betrayal, like this, doesn't start with one act. It builds in the spaces where trust is assumed and never checked. I just chose to finally look. In the weeks that followed, the noise faded faster than I expected. Not because everything was resolved. Legal processes take time. Consequences unfold in measured steps. But because I was no longer carrying what wasn't mine, the weight I had mistaken for responsibility had never belonged to me in the first place. I moved into a smaller place. Quiet, deliberate, mine. No shared drawers, no second toothbrush. No conversations that required me to shrink clarity into comfort. For the first time in a long while, my decisions didn't need translation. Sometimes I think about how easily I could have ignored it, signed where I was told, trusted what I was given, continued living inside a version of reality someone else designed for me. That's the unsettling part. It almost worked. But I've learned something precise. Something that doesn't leave once you see it. Peace isn't built on trust alone. It's built on awareness, on the willingness to look directly at what feels slightly off and follow it to its truth. The future isn't dramatic. It's steady, intentional, clean, and that's enough. Because in the end, I didn't lose a marriage. I reclaimed authorship of my own life, and I won't sign it away again.